now we go to our guest speaker, who is Ross Miller. Ross is a not-for-profit financial consultant joining us today. He's going to talk about financial management in turbulent times. I'm just going to read a little of his bio. He's a certified accountant with over 15 years experience leading finance teams in international corporations and nonprofits. His current focus is providing accounting and finance consulting to nonprofits, where he helps clients to get the most out of their finance systems. He embeds simple yet robust processes and produce succinct, informative information to help manage their businesses. His approach involves coaching non-finance specialists in a straightforward way to improve their accounting knowledge and enable them to make better informed decisions. Prior to consulting, he most recently spent 5 years at the Movember Foundation, where as global financial controller, he led a team across 4 countries responsible for delivering audit management, financial reporting, budgeting, forecasting, and financial modeling. When he isn't knee-deep in spreadsheets, he spends most of his time being jumped on by his nearly 3-year-old and 2 dogs. Welcome, Ross. And Ross, tell me again where you're located.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I currently work out of a home office just outside Raleigh in North Carolina. But
great, we have
from the accent, I didn't grow up too close to here. Originally from the UK.
You're not from North Carolina?
Not quite. No, originally Birmingham in England. So been in the States for about 5 years now.
Great, excellent. Well, good to have you with us, Ross. And we actually have another North Carolinian, at least one other one here with us today. I saw David's name. Hey, Dave Charlton. So you've got a fellow Carolinian, and Danielle Stevenson, our former intern at Canico. Are you originally from North Carolina or from Florida? She may not be able to unmute.
Go Tar Heels.
Anyway, yes, so this is exciting. Thank you. All right, so we have, let me go ahead and flip over to your screen. Give me 1 second here. Okay. And just to give you an idea on time, Ross, so we wrap up at 2. And I just need, 5 minutes before that. So take the time you need. I know we had one question that came in advance of the session. I saw
that, so I'll certainly come on to that.
Whoops. Sorry. All right.
That's great.
So just cue me and I'll flip through this as necessary.
Yeah, sure. Let's if we move to the next slide. I think Kirsten covered most of the intro, so thanks for that. But great to be with you guys today. Yeah, as I said, my initial career over in the UK in working in some big corporates, and then made a transition into the nonprofit sector a few years ago, which I think really was the best career choice I've ever made. Absolutely love working with and for charities, and yeah, no looking back there. And yeah, really that's the direction that I'm looking to continue. Providing help to charities and nonprofits, and helping them to achieve their goals as much as I can.
Excellent. Good to hear. Stay in this sector. We want you here.
Okay. In terms of today, I've pulled together a few broad topics. I could talk for hours about a variety of things financial, but nobody wants to hear an accountant go on for 2 hours. So I try to sort of pull those together into some more succinct categories. As we go along, please feel free to use the chat. If you've got questions on the slides or looking for any clarifications as we go, and then at the end, definitely have time for some Q&A, and yeah, we'll certainly start with the question that we got in advance. Okay. So I think try to sort of apply the lens of the current economic climate to some of the thoughts around today's topics. And I think certainly right now it's critical to really understand sort of what makes up your cost base. And I think one of the first areas you can start with is really assessing what of your costs are truly fixed, and what can be controlled. If you're signed up to a long-term lease on an office, for instance, that's something that there's not a lot you can do, but certainly I think in the current climate, there's certainly no harm in trying to negotiate where possible. I know a lot of organizations are sympathetic to certainly to non-profits and organizations who are paying for facilities that they aren't using, and I think certainly the opportunity is there to try and negotiate anything you can, but otherwise beyond that, starting to take a look at all the costs that you incur, and for anything that seems fixed, try and assess whether that's something that you could change in the short term or in the long term. And something like personnel, for instance, which is typically one of the bigger costs for organizations, that that can be a difficult decision to try and make. And obviously you can't just make decisions instantly, but I think if you try and get a sense of what can I do today and what might I be able to do in 6 months, you can start to prioritize if you need to make changes or reductions to your cost base, to have a bit of an idea of what the best starting point is. And from doing that, you then really sort of have a better sense of what your truly controllable costs are. What's a bit of a nice to have, and what's critical. So if you're paying for subscriptions, what happens if you cancel that? Really thinking pretty objectively about if you took every bill that goes out of the account, what are the impacts of potentially switching it off for a couple of months, knowing that you can switch it back on later, and what really you must do to keep the business running.
Absolutely.
And I think that sort of leads to a lens really where for all the costs that you're incurring, you can start to say, well, what's sort of mission critical, what is focusing on delivering the mission of the organization, what's really sort of doing the work that we're here to do, and making sure that that's something that's prioritized, alongside also saying what am I paying for that's going to help bring revenue in now and into the future. And I think those are probably the two pillars that are the most important to focus on, being able to justify in these times, knowing that as I said, there's always the ability to switch things back on later as we get a better perspective of what the economy is going to be like over the next months and years. Certainly not advocating that we stop spending at all. I think it's just making sure that that really there's that understanding of what our organization's spending, and signing off that you can justify it to yourself and to your donors that that's the right use of the funds in this current climate.
Absolutely. Okay, next one,
please. And I think so. That's great. From doing that starting point as to what am I spending right now, it's good to sort of move from there into thinking about approaches to budgeting. I think certainly right now it's really important to have something to measure yourself against, and give yourself a pathway to get a sense of how well are we controlling our costs, where do we think we're going towards, and how well are we achieving that. So I think there's certainly in these times an importance to making sure that you have an idea of where you're going to be over the next few months. But I think it's on the flip side really important to remember that budgets are just a best estimate at a point in time. They're a snapshot, and as soon as you sign off a budget, it's immediately out of date, in the sense that something new tomorrow. So I think I've seen a couple of organizations I work with go almost too far the other way, and like the accounting teams have basically spent all of the last 3 or 4 months budgeting as something changes new every week, and you can almost get a little bit stuck in that cycle. So
So that brings up a really good point, Ross. How often do you want to be modifying or shifting your forecast, or so what would make sense really to not be too rash and too reactive, but also be adapting to changing circumstances?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think certainly something like a quarterly cycle is probably you know, with each quarter we have new knowledge about certainly like the COVID environment and where that's going. I think lots of organizations have the traditional annual budgeting cycle, and I think it's really difficult right now to say for most organizations, where do we think we're going to be in May of 2021? Where do we think the economy is going to be in May of 2021? And how does that affect our donors and our grantors and the likes, because there's potentially pressure on those as well. So I think that certainly like many organizations will forecast sort of monthly, but I think a quarterly outlook is probably a good way to be able to sort of plant a stake in the ground and give yourself something to measure over a relatively flexible period of time.
So Ross, on the budget, because budgets come up constantly in our trainings and our workshops and even just our conversations with nonprofit organizations, who are the critical people that need to be involved in this ongoing conversation about the budget? Because this is not just the CEO or the ED of the organization, but does it require that all board members be engaged, be involved? What would make the most sense to be able to be adaptable, but still respect the fact that there are other leaders that are helping to provide guidance and governance and fiduciary oversight?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it possibly depends on the size of your organization. I think certainly I see better results when budgets aren't just produced by, say, a CEO and CFO or whatever your roles are. I think if you have more departments that are involved, certainly the people who are spending the cash, it certainly helps to have buy-in that if somebody's involved in a budgeting process and understands what are the goals and what are we trying to achieve, and if we've got to save money across the organization, like how can you help us to make those decisions? I think it's a way of making sure that more people in the organization have that extra level of financial savvy, but also the accountability around you sort of remove I didn't say that we were going to save money, and you get the broader buy-in from the group there. And I think from a board perspective, it probably depends from one organization to another as to how heavily involved that board is with the day-to-day running, because I know that some I'm seeing some that the board are really sort of keen to see information every month as to what that outlook looks like, as opposed to some which are a bit more hands-off and sort of if they're comfortable with management's approach and management across that organization, that they'll sign off and leave the leaders to deliver that. So I think that background perhaps sort of will differ from one place to another, but I think really the more that the sort of senior management team of an organization can contribute and deliver something, that that would be my recommendation to try and implement.
And obviously shared with the board as well, so that the board knows what's going on, what the plan is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's key. People are on the board for a reason. They're there to help guide the organization. They're and it's important, I think, as management to make sure that where possible you leverage the the experience and the contacts and the know-how of the board. It's often the board are the best connected people, and it's who do they know that might help to bring new revenue in, and what expertise do they have? But I think certainly every organization is a little bit different in terms of how hands-on or hands-off that board relationship is. So knowing those people and knowing that relationship is also important to be able to manage that in providing the right level of detail and the right sort of information, to help them shape the decision making as well.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I think, we sort of touched on the sort of quarterly cycle. I think having a shorter outlook is really probably a better approach right now than a longer term one, and sort of knowing that if after a month you think, we things have changed or we weren't quite right, I think it's right to say, well, let's just start again, not trying to measure yourself against something that's out of date or isn't really as appropriate as thought. And I think without wanting people to spend forever in deep in spreadsheets, I think it's certainly good practice to try and consider some alternative scenarios as a way of shaping decision making. So I think it's easy to talk doom and gloom in the current climate, but I think there's also some organizations who are doing well and seeing, I think in the non-profit sector we are seeing people are engaged, and people actually in a lot of cases are sat at home not spending money and looking to try and work with non-profits to help communities. And I think it's good to consider what's a best case scenario, and are there opportunities out there right now in order that some investment might help organizations to grow, but certainly on the flip side, nobody wants to sort of think about really bad outcomes, but I think it's certainly important to just have a sense of what does a worst case next 3-6 months look like. And for instance, if there's not a lot of revenue coming in, what are we spending each month, and what's that doing from a cash flow perspective, which leads into my last point really, which is that from a budgeting perspective, it's really important to make sure that cash is a part of that as well, because from a profit and loss perspective, you can say, well, I've got this much revenue coming in, I think I'm going to have this much going out, but timings can vary, and so I think it's important to make sure that whilst you can have a sort of balanced budget, that the sort of ebbs and flows of cash are really important. And if there's a period midway through where you're expecting a grant or a donation the next month, and you're spending money this month, that you're really mindful of whether that puts pressure on the cash in the bank.
Okay, great.
So I think cash, the old sort of cliche of cash is king is still very much true, and certainly in today's environment. As a non-profit, if you're taking in grants or donations that have got restrictions, it's really important to be able to segregate of the cash in the bank, what's actually what belongs to something programmatic that's got restrictions, and making sure that really it's the operating expenses are coming out of unrestricted funds. And certainly I think a good measure is the burn rate, which is taking a month's worth of operating expenses and dividing that into your unrestricted cash, and that gives you a picture of how many months, if nothing else comes in, how many months of cash do I have on hand, to be able to maintain the same level of expenditure. And from analysing that then gives you a good perspective as to how much pressure is there on the revenue that I'm forecasting to come in, and also like how longer term approach you can really realistically take, as opposed to whether it's more important to focus month on month for balancing sort of cash in and cash out. And I know that certainly some not-profits, like boards, will designate a level of operating reserves, where organisations can afford to do so. Certainly, it's really good practice to do that. But I think in this challenging environment, it's possibly the time to have the conversation with boards where if cash flow is a challenge, is this the rainy day that those rainy day funds were put aside to support? And different boards will have different probably attitudes towards that. I think from more of a day-to-day perspective, certainly it's a great time to review payment terms. A lot of organisations will just naturally sort of receive an invoice, pay it, move on. But it's certainly a good opportunity if cash flow is more of a challenge right now, that there's a starting point which is paying to the vendor's terms, and from there potentially negotiating to say, could I take a longer payment term, and then on the revenue side for organisations that take in a lot of pledges, a pledge on the balance sheet isn't helping to pay anything right now. So it's a conversation to potentially have with donors to say, is there any ability to bring forward the timing of those to help support right now.
I love the way you articulated that. Is there an opportunity or ability to bring forward the payment?
Always try and be diplomatic.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and I think finally on the cash side, it's important to have relationships with the banks, and you make sure that your bank is working for you and really sort of meeting your needs. I know often the banks and the bankers get bad publicity, but certainly a lot of the non-profit banks that I've worked with are really supportive, and having taken a couple of organizations through the Paycheck Protection Program loans, the banks have actually been very, very responsive to that and keen to help. And so you've got sort of the avenues like that where banks, if your bank aren't sort of supportive and helping you to understand what's available, then that's a conversation to have, and then making sure that the day-to-day banking relationships work for you, with regard to it. Is there a need for sort of short-term overdrafts or as a backup, and making sure that those bankers have got your best interests at heart. And then a point around communication. I think this is certainly something, a little bit of a follow-on from the question about who should be involved in the budgeting process, but leading on to who should be involved in understanding the finances of an organisation. I think you certainly see that transparency is valued really highly by employees. When I've seen culture surveys and feedback from staff, a lot of the time, I think staff who aren't at a pretty senior level often feel a little bit left out and don't really know what's happening broadly across the organisation. I think if everybody has a sense that we're all in it together and realistically here's where we're at, it just helps to align people's thinking and focus on how everybody can, everybody's involved in spending money, bringing in money. It helps to reiterate the importance of where an organization's at right now. I think that there's obviously certainly some sensitivity at times if difficult decisions need to be made, but I think for the most part, it's better to give people a sense of where an organization's at rather than throwing surprises out there. Knowing that it really sort of helps to bridge that loyalty, for people feeling like they're valued and consulted. One more cliche for today: the necessity is the mother of invention. I think that really, if there's challenges and people need to come together and help sort of reduce spending or come up with new ideas, the more people that are consulted and have the ability to chip in. Great ideas can come from unexpected places. It doesn't have to be from the leadership. And so from that perspective, I think the collaboration in planning and budgeting can really help organizations to deliver their mission in a more connected kind of way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the risk we run too is exactly what Whitney said, which is that it puts so much responsibility on the CEO or the ED of an organization if we are allowing them or encouraging them, or the board is allowing them to make a lot of these decisions by themselves or to even propose things on their own. It really is such a big burden, and it doesn't have to be. And I think in order to get that creativity, in order to spark ideas, in order to also get support when maybe things have to be cut or they have to be diverted, it really has to be a shared responsibility and a collaborative effort. So I completely agree. All right.
Okay, and yeah, that leads us to any questions.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that question we got in advance about audits. So I think it was Max or Eric, right? One of you posed the question in an email prior to today. Would you mind expanding on that, Eric or Max?
Sure. I'm just concerned that in the grant application process, a grantor may want to look at your record, and then they would probably want to ask if you've had an audit. Mm-hmm. I fall in the category of a smaller nonprofit, which there was really not very much to audit so far. So I'm just wondering if there will be a yes without showing a professional audit to your company.
Good question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the people issuing grants will typically have a sense of the size of organizations they're dealing with, and should be mindful of small nonprofits not wanting to spend unnecessary money on bringing in external accountants to do audits if they fall beneath the thresholds for doing so. I think in terms of sort of grant reporting in general, often you'll see within like the terms and conditions when people are issuing grants that it often talks about sort of the right to audit numbers, but certainly most organizations don't have teams of people employed to go and sort of drive to your offices and check those things out. I think mm-hmm. In general, a lot of grants have got reporting requirements. So both from an impact perspective and also from a spending perspective, and in that regard, it's certainly important to track. Once any grants have been received, it's really important to be able to track within your accounts what's been spent against that, both from a reporting perspective, but also from your own understanding of what was the true cost of delivering, what the funding was for, and is that different from what you expected when you applied. But I think certainly in terms of that sort of application, I would just encourage you to be open within that application as much as you can. Within, if it's online, you might sort of have some restrictions around what you can click, but if it's something that you can sort of drop in an explanation to say, we're small and/or we're new and haven't had a formal external audit, I think it's probably a fairly standard question where they're just looking to make sure that they're being fiscally responsible with money that they're giving out, and it's to organizations who are following good practice with regard to managing funds.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anything else on that, Eric?
No, that's clear enough for me.
I know that in my experience, I've seen that a review as opposed to a full audit sometimes satisfies funder requirements, even on a temporary basis. So which typically it's maybe half the cost, is that right? And I know Jerry Friends is another financial expert who's on the call today. So feel free to weigh in, Jerry. But typically from my understanding, a review can be about half the cost of a full audit. And I know with one organization that we worked with, it satisfied that need for the first year. And we explained that we planned to have a full audit the second year, but for the first year, we were going to conduct a review. And that seemed to satisfy the funder. What are your thoughts on that, Ross?
Yeah, I think
every funder is different probably though, right?
Yeah, it's going to be different from sort of the size and scope as well, I think.
Okay. And then Whitney's asking, what level of transparency? Oh, this is a good one, Whitney. What level of transparency do you recommend with staff and with donors about the financial situation?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. I think part of that's going to be determined by the general culture of the organization. I think if on the whole, you're pretty transparent with stuff about plans in general, then it makes a lot of sense that that's followed up by transparency around the accounts. I think it certainly doesn't need to be to the very last dollar, but I think staff having an understanding of, you know, the level of security there is in your accounts is certainly helpful. You know, just in being able to get the buy-in as to is there a need to potentially cut costs, and you know, helping them to feel invested in managing the spend. I think with donors, it maybe depends on a little on the size of the organization, but if you have got audited financial statements, then really best practice is to publish those. If you've got a website, you know, if you're within the realms of having to complete a Form 990, that's publicly available information anyway. You know, people can go onto Charity Navigator or somewhere like that and just pull the information up. So, you know, from that perspective, nonprofits have got that level of governance enforced. So, you know, I think you can't really hide, given that information's out there in the public domain anyway. So it makes more sense to be transparent around, you know, what are you doing with the money that donors are bringing in, and really then it's about how you market that to those donors to say, here's where the money's going to go, and this is the impact and the outputs from those dollars.
Okay, great. Does anyone else have a question? I always have a couple of questions, but does anyone else have a question right now that you'd like to ask? Feel free to put it in the chat, or you can unmute. Excuse me.
Ross, I have a question. This is Jerry. It's easy for financial people to explain where we ought to cut expenses, but one thing I've done, especially in the last few months because of the pandemic, is encourage them to spend money on either Zoom calls, recording Zoom calls, or explaining what we're doing differently now than what we did before the pandemic. Because if you're working with kids in an after-school program and everybody knows that the after-school program has been closed down, they don't realize that the nonprofits are doing a lot of work, and a lot of it's through video. And what I ask some of them is to record those videos to tell their story. And that's relatively low cost, especially with the technology we have today. So I'm just curious if you've experienced the same thing where you're actually telling people to either build content or tell their story more now than they ever had to do before.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Jerry. It's a huge yes. You know, I think firstly, there's many organizations where in the current climate, staff are, you know, not as busy as they were, or they're, you know, some of their typical day-to-day function is sort of on hold, or some projects are on hold, and so, you know, it's an opportunity to use some of that capacity. But yeah, absolutely. While folks are at home, and, you know, as more and more demographics become, you know, technologically savvy, you know, if I think about my parents' generation, like they're all on Facebook now, so you know, there's certainly opportunities to make low cost, high impact content, but absolutely, I think it's being able to share, you know, we are still working hard. Here's what we're working on. Here's where, you know, money that you've given in the past is going right now. Here's what we're planning to do. As you say, things like Zoom recordings, you know, YouTube, you can set up a YouTube account for free and start posting things, you know, and host to that from your website, from Facebook, from you know, various social media. So yeah, absolutely, it's you know, low cost, high impact, you know, and a great way to engage with donor bases of various ages and demographics.
Thank you, Jerry. I love that, Ross. I'm interested in the burn rate, your mention of the burn rate, because that to me has always been, even running a for-profit business, I've always been very, very focused on what is that base level monthly expenditure that we can anticipate, and then ensuring that we're well positioned to be able to cover that. But I think exchanging paid subscriptions for unpaid subscriptions is, and that's something you touched on about the subscription idea, I think we don't take advantage of that enough. There are so many platforms that are being offered at no cost right now. Danny Albertus discovered Give Lively. It's Give Lively, right, Tanaka? I think so. Which is free, and it allows you to take donations, and I believe there is already, or they're building out a CRM, a back end to it. But you know, the more time goes on, the more we see all of these incredible opportunities that are now being offered at no cost, or you can switch them, right? So if you signed up for Zoom or QuickBooks, and TechSoup has their subscription or administrative cost, but you can get it at such a reduced price, switching to an alternative that's low cost or no cost makes so much sense as well. So Sarah mentions she just found out about Cyber Grants Front Door. Has anyone else used it? I have not heard of that. Cyber Grants Front Door. I know Cyber Grants is the back end for a lot of foundations and proposals. Has anyone else heard of Cyber Grants Front Door? Similar to Benevity? Anybody heard of it? I mean, it's really amazing what you can do if you do some digging and set your mind to, you know, cutting some costs.
Yeah, I on top of that, I would say, like, oftentimes companies don't publish, you know, outwardly that they offer non-profit discounts, and often if you, like, if you're on a website and you can just try and find a way to live chat or talk to a real person, you know, often you can find that there's some great discounts available that just aren't you know, aren't advertised on people's sites. So that's definitely
so true.
Always ask, you know, the worst is somebody says no, we don't, but you know, often you can find that they're actually really substantial.
Completely agree. Always ask. You just have no idea what you could get for free. Absolutely. And it could be maybe they give you 3 months free of a, you know, a year subscription or something. I mean, anything is a discount in any way is going to be helpful. So absolutely. Okay. Who else has questions for Ross? Does anyone else have any financial questions? I'm always interested in helping with questions about budgeting and program budgets versus organization budgets. I think the one thing that I would wonder about is if we've prepared a program budget or an organization budget and submitted it with a grant proposal, and things change, or we revisit it on a quarterly basis, and we've seen had to make some adjustments, or we've seen some unanticipated changes. How frequently or readily, or what would your recommendation be in terms of communication with that foundation and saying things have changed, or we've had to deviate a little bit, or I mean, what do you think, Ross? What would be the best received, let's say, on their end?
Yeah, I think if you've sort of reevaluated your position and you're pretty confident that what you know now is different from what you proposed, and for instance, you know, they've given you a grant of a certain amount, and that's not going to actually fully fulfill what you're hoping to do. I think, you know, be open, be transparent, and sort of share that news sooner rather than later. You know, to see if there's potential for either changing the scope a little bit or for any further funds. I think it's always better to be open and start that conversation sooner rather than getting to a real crunch point where knowing that often like those foundations may need time to sort of discuss and meet and take it. So you don't want to get to the point where you're having to stop doing something or concerned about having run out of money right away when that's something that could have been discussed a little bit sooner.
Absolutely. And I guess
let me echo that comment.
Yeah, go ahead, Jerry.
Don't be afraid to talk to your funder. I know a lot of organizations said they were going to do something and things changed and they're afraid to talk to them. And I agree with what you said, Ross. No, pick up the phone, explain what's going on. And what I have experienced is a lot of funders right now are very receptive. They appreciate that you're calling them and they're very receptive to understand the situation and modify whatever plan you had. So my comment to everybody is don't be afraid to pick up the phone and talk to them.
We're always so worried about being judged, right? We feel like it's going to be a strike against us. And yet,
yeah, absolutely. And I think if a foundation's made the decision that they want to fund you, that they're obviously invested in that cause. To that point, they're not here to. Nobody wants to see, great nonprofits fail, and it's certainly always have that conversation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Okay, good. Thank you, Jerry. Okay, anyone else? Anything else? Okay, so my takeaways. Everyone knows I love my takeaways because I go back to these. They've become like my little bullet points for the day. So I love the idea of a quarterly update for the budget. I love that you said that it's okay to start over. If you just look at it and you think, and you have to start over from scratch and rebuild the budget, well, so be it. I think exploring alternative scenarios, Jerry and I have talked about this a lot, and this is something that always resonates with me because it's not something I ever used to do until I started talking to Jerry, and he was talking about having these best case, worst case, likely. And I think there is a little bit of peace of mind that comes with doing that. What is the very worst that can happen? And then because that also forces you to start thinking about solutions, and we're all problem solvers here. I mean, we're all solving some sort of problem out in the community. So it really prompts you then to be thinking of alternatives. And best case scenario, I think, is great too, because then you can start looking at what the potential is for additional programming or services or layering things, or maybe building that cash reserve that you haven't had a chance to build up until this point. I love the idea of being very familiar with your burn rate, which I recognize could also change from month to month, and telling the stories. To me, that's critical too. So making sure that those stories are getting out there. And Jerry, thank you for sharing that, because I think that's really important as well. So anything from anyone else at this point? Oops, my screen keeps on flipping here. All right, Ross, thank you very much. Really appreciate your wisdom today.